You don't like to talk then?
Well, not really. Sometimes if there's something to say, but there's really nothing to say these days.
George Harrison smiled for the cameras, but behind the scenes, one person made his life a living hell. 4 years, this Beatles bandmate controlled every note George played, mocked his spiritual beliefs, and treated him like a servant. In 1969, George finally snapped and walked out of the studio. But that wasn't the worst part. What this person did during George's darkest moments crossed every line of friendship. The betrayal was so deep that George carried the anger until his final breath. Today, we're revealing the shocking truth about the Beatle George Harrison truly hated more than anyone. George Harrison was born on February 25, 1943, in a tiny house at 12, Arnold Grove, Liverpool, England. The night he was born, the city was under its 78th night in a row of bombing during World War II, a terrifying time. His father, Harold, earned just £3 a week as a bus conductor, working incredibly long 14-hour shifts, and even walking miles to save money on bus fare. George shared a bed with his brothers until he was 16 years old because their home was so small. His mother, Louise, worked nights cleaning offices, earning only a couple of shillings for each building. Their entire food budget for the whole week was just 15 shillings, which was very little money. Yet somehow, Louise made their little home warm and full of hope. In 1955, when George was 12, he was riding his bicycle past a house when he heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel playing through an open window. He stopped, frozen in place, and listened to the entire song. That moment changed everything for him. Elvis's sound, especially the echo on the guitar, lit a huge fire inside George. He rushed home and told his mother he needed a guitar more than he needed food. From then on, music completely took over his life. At 14, George finally got his first guitar. He walked all the way to Frank Hess's music shop to get a cheap, Eggman flat-top guitar for £3, 10 shillings. It was painful to play, and his fingers bled for weeks because the strings were so hard, but he practiced 6 to 8 hours a day. He learned Rock Island Line first and soon stopped caring about school altogether. He failed almost every subject except art. His teacher even wrote in a report that George cared more about guitars than geometry. That same year, George met Paul McCartney. They were on the number 86 bus to Liverpool when Paul noticed George's guitar. George told him he could play 20 Flight Rock, which was no easy task for a young guitarist. Paul was impressed. Soon after, George tried out for Paul's band, the Quarrymen. He played raunchy perfectly, even though he was just 14 years and 364 days old, almost 15. John Lennon, who was older, didn't want to add someone so young to the band. But George's talent couldn't be denied. He became the youngest member of what would become the most famous band in history, the Beatles. The Harrison family supported George in ways that most people wouldn't believe. His mother, Louise, even picked up a third job cleaning the Cavern Club, where the band often played, just to help pay for his music needs. Harold, his father, allowed George to ride the bus for free, even though he could have lost his job for it. When George needed a better guitar, they sold their piano. When the band had their first paid concert, Louise even pawned her wedding ring so they could rent an amplifier, which made their electric guitars loud enough to be heard. Every penny they had went toward George's dream. One key moment came when Paul McCartney froze during a performance and couldn't play his guitar solo. The band realized they really needed a proper lead guitarist who could play without mistakes. Paul pushed hard for George to join, but Lennon wasn't sure. George was still just a kid in John's eyes. Eventually, Paul convinced him. They arranged a second audition on a double-decker bus outside Wilson Hall. George played raunchy again, and this time Lennon finally agreed. Later research showed George had actually joined by December 7, 1957, even earlier than most people thought. From the very beginning, Lennon treated George more like a little brother than an equal member of the band. The 3-year age gap between them was a big deal back then. George's ideas were often ignored, and he felt like he wasn't being taken seriously. Over time, that tension only grew stronger. During the Let It Be recording sessions in 1969, George finally exploded. He told Lennon he wasn't happy and actually left the band for a while. Lennon even talked about bringing in famous guitarist Eric Clapton as a replacement. George later said he felt pushed out, especially after John's new girlfriend, Yoko Ono, entered Lennon's life and spent a lot of time in the studio. When George first joined the Quarrymen, the band was already falling apart. Most of the original members left soon after. They kept changing names, trying to find the right one: Johnny and the Moondogs, Japage 3, Long John and the Silver Beatles, before finally landing on the Beatles in 1960. George's arrival also marked a big change in their sound. They went from playing skiffle, a type of folk music, to real rock and roll. He and Paul added special parts called pickups to their guitars and bought an Elpico amplifier, giving the group their first electric sound. George's technical skills on the guitar really helped shape the early Beatles sound. Then came Hamburg, Germany, a brutal test of their survival. In 1960, they were booked to play at a club called the Kaiserkeller. They played 8 hours a day, stretching songs for as long as possible just to fill the time. The club owner demanded they perform like wild animals to keep the crowds excited. George was just 17 years old at the time. Their living space was behind the stage, incredibly filthy, and shared with other bands. They barely slept. The club bouncer was a former boxer who had actually killed someone in a street fight, making the atmosphere very dangerous. It was rough, but it made them professionals and taught them how to survive in the music business. George also played at the Star Club in 1962, performing every night in front of huge crowds, learning what it meant to truly make it in music. On February 9, 1964, something unforgettable happened on American television. 73 million people tuned in to watch the Beatles perform on The Ed Sullivan Show. That was over 60% of every TV turned on in the country that night. CBS, the TV network, had received 50,000 ticket requests, even though the studio only had 728 seats. To give you an idea, back in 1957, Elvis Presley's first appearance on the show only brought in 7,000 requests. That night, Ed Sullivan had his highest ratings in 7 years, with a 45.3 rating and a 60 share, which means a huge number of people were watching. Even Richard Nixon's daughters, Julie and Tricia, were in the audience. The Beatles played 5 songs: All My Loving, Till There Was You, She Loves You, I Saw Her Standing There, and I Want to Hold Your Hand. As they sang, each of their names appeared on the screen. When John Lennon's name came up, the text underneath read, "Sorry girls, he's married." That moment didn't just entertain. It set off Beatlemania across America and launched what would be known as the British Invasion, where many British bands became popular in the U.S. It changed pop culture forever. A few months before that big moment, George Harrison had already taken his first step toward songwriting. It was August 1963. He was stuck in bed with an illness at the Palace Court Hotel in Bournemouth. A doctor told him to rest and gave him a tonic to feel better. Bored and with nothing to do, Harrison picked up a tape recorder and began messing around with ideas for songs. He later said it was just to see if he could write a song at all. That effort became the song, Don't Bother Me. In one recording that still exists, you can hear him working on the middle part of the song and whistling the melody because the words weren't ready yet. A journalist from Liverpool, Bill Harry, said he had pushed Harrison to write something, and Harrison had snapped back, "Don't bother me." And that line became the song title. Years later, Harrison said the song wasn't very good and might not even count as a real song, but it proved something important to him. It showed him he could write songs, and he just needed to keep trying. The track appeared on the album with the Beatles later that year and marked the first time George contributed a song to a Beatles album. But even after that, Harrison hit a wall. While John Lennon and Paul McCartney were writing almost every single song on each album, George was often limited to just 2 songs per record. From 1965 on, this rule stayed in place. It created a lot of tension that built up for years. In 2022, Paul admitted there had been an unspoken rule. He and John had made an early agreement that they would be the ones writing songs. Paul said, "We never said, let's keep George out of it," but it was understood. George found it hard to even get the band to record his songs. Lennon, McCartney, and their producer, George Martin, didn't fully respect his work until near the very end of the Beatles' time together. It wasn't until 1969 that Paul finally said, "Now this year, his songs are at least as good as ours." Media attention didn't help either. Each Beatle was given a label by the public. Lennon was the smart one. Paul was the cute one. George was the quiet one. Ringo was the lucky one. That's how the public saw them. From 1964 to 1970, the Beatles had the top-selling song in America 1 out of every 6 weeks, and the top-selling album 1 out of every 3 weeks. They were the first pop group since Buddy Holly to release a full album of original songs when A Hard Day's Night came out in July 1964. But the fame mostly centered on John and Paul. Their names were in every headline, and their songwriting partnership was what people talked about. George's role, even though it shaped the band's sound in huge ways, often got overlooked. Around 1965, the pressure and limitations began to wear on him. That same year, he started experimenting with Indian music and also had his first LSD trip. In March, the Beatles met Swami Vishnu Devananda and were given a copy of the complete illustrated book of yoga. Later that summer, during a visit to Elvis Presley, Harrison learned a little more about yoga. Though he didn't take much interest at first, by the end of 1966, things had changed. He was reading seriously about spiritual teachers like Vivekananda and Yogananda. He wasn't just curious. He was looking for something deeper, something meaningful. In summer 1967, he and John spent hours chanting the Hare Krishna mantra while on LSD in Greece. By August, all 4 Beatles went to see Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, which led to their famous trip to Rishikesh in 1968, a very spiritual place in India. For George, these weren't just spiritual hobbies. They were a way to deal with the intense pressure he felt and to find peace when he felt invisible within the band. In April 1965, while filming their movie Help, at Twickenham Studios, Harrison had a moment that changed everything for his music. In one scene, Indian musicians were playing in the background. While everyone waited between takes, George picked up a sitar out of curiosity. He thought the sound was strange at first, but something about it stuck with him. Around the same time, bands like the Yardbirds and the Kinks were releasing songs with Indian-style influences. But George took it much further. While the rest of the band was getting high during filming, George was focused on something else entirely. He was finding a sound that no other guitarist had. The sitar would become his signature. A year later, in June 1966, Harrison met Ravi Shankar, a famous sitar player, at the home of Ayana Deva Angudi. It wasn't just a friendly meeting. Within 3 months, George and Ravi had both cleared their schedules to travel across India together for 6 weeks. Usually, students had to wait years to learn from Shankar, who was a master. But he agreed to teach George almost right away. Shankar said George asked questions constantly and seemed deeply interested in both Indian music and religion. At first, Ravi thought the sitar part on Norwegian would sounded strange, but he realized George wasn't just playing around, he was truly dedicated. Their connection felt like fate. On October 12, 1965, George recorded that sitar part for Norwegian Wood. It was the very first time an Indian instrument had ever been used in a Western pop song. He had bought the sitar on Oxford Street in London. It came from a music shop in Kolkata, India. George said it happened quickly. He found the right notes, they fit the song, and that was it. That simple moment changed the direction of rock music. The song kicked off the short-lived raga rock trend and inspired a wave of sitar use in pop songs by other artists. Years later, that same sitar was sold at auction for $62,500. The bidding had started at $50,000. George had given it away during his honeymoon in Barbados to a friend of his wife, Pattie Boyd. But not everyone in the band was thrilled with his growing love for Indian music. In 1968, the Beatles went to India to study with the Maharishi. Harrison wanted to meditate and focus deeply on his spiritual journey. Paul had a different plan. He kept writing songs for what would become the White Album. It led to a serious clash between them. Paul later said, "George actually once got quite annoyed and told me off because I was trying to think of the next album." George fired back, saying, "We're not here to do the next album. We're here to meditate." That moment showed the deep difference between them. Paul liked to work non-stop, always creating. George waited for inspiration and preferred a slower pace. Paul thought George's spiritual focus might be risky or even a little silly. George thought Paul didn't understand what really mattered in life. George Harrison was always called the quiet Beatle. But behind that quiet image was a storm brewing for years. In 1966, George finally got his moment to shine. On the Revolver album, he wrote not just one, but 3 songs. Taxman opened the entire record, and Love You Too, and I Want to Tell You followed. This was a big deal because, until then, he had barely been allowed to contribute. But the moment he stepped forward, the others pushed him back again. When they began working on Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band later that year, George brought a song called Only a Northern Song. It was critical of how songwriting credits and money were handled in the band, basically complaining about how he was being treated unfairly. Lennon and McCartney didn't just reject it, they made sure he only got 1 song on the album. Paul later claimed George just didn't show much interest in contributing. But that wasn't the truth. George was shut out and later called the whole Sgt. Pepper's album experience boring. He ended up recording Within You Without You alone. Literally, he was the only Beatle in the studio that day. Indian musicians came in to help, but not John, not Paul, not Ringo. Even when the track was finished with strings added by producer George Martin, the others still didn't bother to show up. It was the first time a Beatles song had been created without any involvement from the rest of the band. Lennon later said it was one of George's best songs, but at the time, he hadn't even cared enough to attend the recording. Paul's attitude made things even worse. He openly made fun of George's growing interest in Indian music and spirituality. George was diving deep into Hinduism, reading ancient Vedic texts, and learning the sitar for hours. Paul would often roll his eyes, crack jokes, and even leave the room during George's recording sessions for his Indian-inspired music. George felt deeply mocked and disrespected. He once said they didn't even try to understand what he was bringing to the band. That hurt him deeply because it wasn't just music anymore. It was spiritual, and they treated it like a joke. Everyone said the Beatles worked like a democracy, where everyone had an equal say, but that was never true. Lennon and McCartney controlled everything. George usually got only 1 or 2 songs per album while they filled the rest. Even when George had better songs, they were pushed aside. He didn't even own his own song publishing, like they did. He was paid less, given less credit, and heard less. Bob Dylan once said, George had to fight to get anything on the records. And it was true. He wasn't treated like an equal partner. He was treated more like an assistant. By 1967, George had a pile of amazing songs that the others wouldn't even listen to. All Things Must Pass was one of them. He brought it to the Let It Be sessions. Lennon and McCartney laughed it off, saying it didn't fit the Beatles' style. That same session was full of intense tension. George even gave the song to keyboardist Billy Preston at one point just to get it away from John and Paul. When he released it himself 3 years later, it became a classic. So did his other famous songs like My Sweet Lord and Isn't It a Pity? Even a song called Not Guilty, which they tried to record over 100 times before giving up, became a strong solo track for him. Those songs proved he had been right all along about their quality. Then came the breaking point. On January 10th, 1969, George actually walked out of the studio. Cameras were rolling at Twickenham Studios because they were filming the Get Back documentary. The band was rehearsing their song, Get Back. Paul kept nitpicking George's guitar playing, constantly telling him what to do. It wasn't new. George had taken it for a whole week. But that day, something snapped inside him. He left without making a big scene. He just calmly said he was done. Later that night, he wrote in his diary like it was a normal day, went home, recorded another song. 8 chips. 4 days earlier, he had reached his limit on camera. Paul had been telling him how to play again. George just looked at him and said calmly, I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all. That moment, filmed and archived forever, showed just how much he had been pushed. It wasn't angry. It was a quiet resignation, a feeling of giving up. That's what made it so powerful. That same night he quit, George went home and wrote a song called Wah Wah. The title meant 2 things. It was a guitar effect, but it was also slang for a headache or a big problem. That's how he described the band. He recorded it for his solo album, and it sounded loud, sharp, and confident. He didn't even offer it to the Beatles when he came back 5 days later. Instead, he gave them I, Me, Mine, a song about selfishness. He had decided that the best of his songs would be for himself, not for the band that treated him so poorly. At home, things were no better for George. His wife, Patty Boyd, said George would come back from the studio angry and miserable. The arguments between George and the other Beatles were constant, and she saw how much it changed him. She said George didn't even like Paul's personality anymore. They barely spoke outside of music. George was trying to find peace through spirituality, but the Beatles were tearing him apart. When he finally agreed to return to the band, it was only after laying down serious conditions. He demanded they move their recording sessions from Twickenham Studios to Apple Studios, their own studio. He canceled the planned live TV concert they were supposed to do. And most importantly, he demanded more chances to contribute his songs to the albums. They had to promise. It was humiliating for everyone. John even jokingly said they'd just get Eric Clapton if George didn't come back. That hurt George deeply, but he came back anyway because he still cared, at least for a little while. But nothing really changed. The damage to their friendship and musical relationship was done. One of the most painful moments came during the recording of Hey Jude. George tried to add guitar riffs after Paul's vocal lines. Paul directly told him to stop, saying it didn't fit the song. George stayed silent, but later Paul admitted it was insulting to George. He said George was one of the greats, and he still had to tell him to back off. That's how far things had fallen between them. Then came Maxwell's Silver Hammer. Paul loved the song and wanted it on the album. The others hated it. They spent 4 long days recording it, with 16 takes on the first day alone. John skipped the sessions because he couldn't stand it. Ringo called it the worst recording experience of his life. George said it was fruity and awful, but they did it anyway because Paul wanted it so badly. Finally, in late 1969, George got a win. His song Something was released as a double A-side single with John Lennon's Come Together. This meant they were considered equally important on the record. It was the first time George had ever received equal billing. He told a reporter, "Big deal, eh?" The song hit #1 in the US, and it's still one of the Beatles' most loved songs. Lennon even said it was the best track on the Abbey Road album, which was huge praise. But it had taken too long for George to be recognized. He had been writing songs like that for years. They just didn't listen to him. On his solo album, All Things Must Pass, George released a song called Run of the Mill. It was clearly aimed at Paul. The title was a play on words, meaning ordinary, but the meaning behind it was sharp and critical. George sang about the messy situation at Apple Corps, the Beatles' company, and how Paul kept saying everyone else was useless. He sang about how Paul blamed others for everything. The lyrics were honest, even sad, but they didn't hold back his true feelings. By 1974, George was ready to say it out loud. In an interview, he stated that Paul had ruined his confidence as a guitar player. He said he didn't know if he was good or bad anymore because of Paul's constant criticism. Another musician in Paul's band had even quit for the same reason. George wasn't just angry, he was deeply wounded. He had spent years being told how to play, what to play, and when to play it by someone he thought was his friend. Meanwhile, his marriage to Pattie Boyd in 1966 looked like a fairy tale from the outside. They had met on the set of A Hard Day's Night, and by all appearances, George had found his muse. But behind the scenes, things were falling apart. By 1970, his best friend, Eric Clapton, was secretly in love with Pattie. He wrote her desperate letters and even composed his famous song, Layla, to try and win her over. Pattie, initially thinking it was from a fan, showed one of the letters to George. It wasn't from a fan, it was from the man George often invited into their home. The painful love triangle dragged on for years. George and Pattie finally divorced in 1977. 2 years later, she married Clapton. That marriage also ended in heartbreak years later. The letters Clapton wrote to Pattie sold at auction for $3.6 million, showing how intense the situation was. Then came an even deeper betrayal. George had an affair with Ringo Starr's wife, Maureen. He didn't even try to hide it. At a dinner party, he looked Ringo in the eye and said, "I'm in love with your wife." Ringo, trying to stay calm and not cause a scene, reportedly replied, "Better you than someone we don't know." But the real explosion came when Pattie caught them together in a locked bedroom at George's estate. She stood outside shouting, furious. George reportedly just laughed. John Lennon, hearing about it later, called it virtual incest because it was so close to home. The result, both marriages collapsed in 1975. 2 Beatles families were torn apart by one man's choices. What made it more shocking was George's public image. He often spoke about peace, faith, and enlightenment like a very spiritual person. But the people closest to him described a man full of anger, jealousy, and sometimes even a strong desire for things like sex and drugs. His second wife, Olivia, tried to be diplomatic, simply saying George just loved women. Ringo put it more bluntly, George was a bag of beads and a bag of anger. He dated only supermodels and cheated constantly. He claimed to be searching for spiritual truth, but he also often fell into cocaine binges and emotional outbursts. Friends said it was like dealing with two different people. George's drug use wasn't limited to the Beatles' early psychedelic days. It went far beyond that. He took his first LSD trip in 1965 after a dentist slipped it into his drink without warning. That experience changed him forever, but it also led him down a path of deeper dependency on other substances. In the 1970s, he was smoking up to 4 packs of cigarettes a day and using cocaine regularly. Yet, even as he struggled with his own addictions, he famously warned Elton John to stay off the marching powder, cocaine. He could lecture others, but couldn't stop himself. And while he claimed to reject materialism, George surrounded himself with luxury. His estate, Friar Park, wasn't just a home, it was a palace with 120 rooms and sprawling gardens. He collected exotic cars and only dated women the tabloids called goddesses. His songs told fans to let go of their ego and worldly possessions. But his life often told a different story. Even when he traveled to India, it wasn't as a humble seeker, it was as a rock star with VIP treatment. The title of his 1973 album, Living in the Material World, perfectly captured the conflict inside him. He was stuck between two very different lives. But just when people started to see him as a hypocrite, George pulled off one of the greatest musical comebacks ever. In 1970, he released All Things Must Pass, a triple album that didn't just do well, it crushed the charts. It hit #1 in both albums and singles, something Lennon and McCartney couldn't match at the time with their own solo work. The album sold millions, earned gold and platinum certifications, and critics called it the war and peace of rock and roll, meaning it was a huge, important work. George had been limited to 2 songs per Beatles record, but now he was proving he could carry 3 albums by himself. He didn't stop there. In 1971, George joined John Lennon on the song How Do You Sleep?, a brutal lyrical attack on Paul McCartney. George's distinctive slide guitar cut through the track as John verbally tore into Paul's ego and music. Even Ringo Starr showed up during the session and reportedly tried to calm them down. But George stayed, playing through the tension. He later said it was a strange time full of intense feelings. The public didn't just hear the feud, they could feel it in every note of the song. That same year, George organized something no rock star had ever done before, a massive benefit concert for a foreign crisis. The concert for Bangladesh was held at Madison Square Garden in New York City, with 2 sold-out shows and a total of 40,000 people in the crowd. The lineup included legends like Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, Billy Preston, Leon Russell, and even Ringo Starr. Paul McCartney, notably, refused to attend. George raised nearly $12 million by 1985 through album and film sales from the concert. It was the first concert of its kind and showed the world that George wasn't just a songwriter, he could move mountains for a humanitarian cause. But behind the scenes, the Beatles were collapsing into a legal war. When Paul McCartney sued the others in December 1970 to officially break up the band and separate their money, Harrison, Lennon, and Starr united to fight back. They submitted papers insisting the band could still go on. It was a strategic lie. They knew it was over, but they didn't want Paul to win outright. The court eventually sided with McCartney. The band's assets were frozen and eventually divided. Harrison had clearly chosen his side, and it wasn't Paul's. Years later, the wound still hadn't healed. At the Beatles' 1988 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony, Paul didn't show up. Ringo had reportedly had too much to drink. That left George to accept the honor alone. His speech tried to smooth things over, saying they all loved John and Paul. But the message was clear. The Beatles were honored as legends, but they were still broken as friends. Then came the night everything changed. George passed away on November 29, 2001, in a house in Los Angeles. He was 58 years old. His last words to the world, shared through his wife Olivia and son Donnie, were, "Everything else can wait. But the search for God cannot wait." That had always been George's true calling, his deep spiritual quest. Through all the drama, all the heartbreak, and all the contradictions in his life, he never stopped trying to find peace and meaning. What do you think was the biggest challenge George Harrison faced during his time in the Beatles and in his life after? Share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. If you found this journey into George's story eye-opening, please give this video a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of music legends.